Ashe County Oral History Project, January the 22nd, 1981. An interview with John C. Miller, teacher at Northwest Ashe High School. Interviewer Clarice Weaver. I think we've been covering a wide range of subjects here, and all of them so very interesting. Let's see, I believe we got you through the Army and teaching at Bristol School.
Right.
Now, through college, I should say. Bristol School is no longer, you no longer have school at Bristol, is that right?
Right.
Now, what do you recall the year? Was it about, in the 50s or 60s that they abolished it?
64, 63, 64, 64, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Bristol School, I think, was the consolidated effort in Ashe County. There are so few blacks in Ashe County until it, I guess, was no longer feasible to have schools in the various communities. For example, in my community, maybe there was half a dozen black families. Up the river at Creston, there might have been 2 or 3 black families. Up at Todd or Baldwin, there was 2 or 3 black families. So you reached a point where you couldn't have a black school in the black communities because there's so few blacks. So Bristol School, I think, came about as a result of the county superintendent, and I guess it was Mr. Hurt at that time, getting together some of the black school committeemen from various communities, and then they had the committee system. And they came up with the idea of building this one black school centrally located. And all of this was done during the time, I think, that I was in the Army. And maybe the actual building started when I was in college, because when I went to Bristol my first year in 50, there were no bathrooms.
Is that right?
It was a cinder block building that had 4 rooms and a hallway. 3 of the rooms were designated as classrooms, and 1 of the rooms was designated as a lunchroom. And there was no bathrooms. And they were building, though, the bathrooms the year that I went there. They were installing the bathrooms because they were using the outdoor toilets that fall. So Bristol School then was an outgrowth of consolidation, and it supposedly taught grade 1 through 12.
Is that right? Did you have enough for a basketball team?
No, we did not have any organized sports program at all. None. No clubs. No organized sports. We would play a little. Mr. Oddie was very interested in basketball.
Was he the principal?
Mr. Oddie was principal when I went there. We would play basketball, just classes, or just get a group of boys together and play basketball. We'd play softball. We did play a lot of the white schools softball. We'd play Jefferson School. We'd play Riverview. We'd play Nathan's Creek. We would play Lansing.
So you did get to be competitive with them?
Yes, we would play them, but I mean, we couldn't play them in any league or anything of that nature, but they were just willing to play us as a team as such. And I think the games that we did play, we got along fine. We had no problems at all.
Oh, my. Well, so you had small classes then, didn't you?
We had small. I think our total enrollment, possibly the maximum, was at one time maybe 65 persons in the 12th grade. And I think when the school was finally disbanded, there was only about 55 children in the 12th grades, which means that you would have maybe only 4 or 5 persons in a given grade, or not a great number in any grade.
Well, this I understand from talking with someone that you know, in some areas throughout the country that when they integrated a school, the white people just became so upset, as we know about, and didn't want it at all. But as I understand it, the white people didn't mind, but the black people didn't want to integrate. Some of them didn't. Is that correct?
Well, we had some persons in the black community, I'll put it this way, we had some persons in the black community who felt that blacks would be better off if they had their own school. Now, I might give you a little basis for that thinking. A lot of them felt that if you take my child from the black school and put him in the white school, in all probability he might be neglected. There would be no one to look out after his interest. He may suffer name calling. Various things like that were worries for black parents. So you had some black parents who felt like things might be better if they maintained the black schools. In fact, I can remember one time we had the Board of Education, a meeting at the black school for the purpose of airing public opinion among blacks. And I think at that time maybe some of the members of the Board of Education anticipated that they may hear something about integration, or maybe may have some requests for doing something to the black school, renovating it and making it more attractive or more conducive to learning. But oddly enough, the black parents expressed no complaints, no opinion on integration. I don't think it was ever brought out at all. In fact, I had some of the black committeemen who did not want to push for any immediate things. I don't know why they did not. Well, I think I do in a way, but I had told the children many years ago that sometimes I might have been doing them more harm than good, because I was a black teacher there. Well, at the time the schools were integrated, I was principal, but I was teaching 4 classes, 4 grades, let's put it that way. And I was trying to teach each grade a minimum of 5 classes a day. And there was no conceivable way that I could devote 55 minutes of classroom work to a group in that manner. So I was really cheating them. And I told them that by and large they probably would be better off if and when integration came about, because they would not be denied the regular 55-minute period, and then they would have access to courses that we just could not offer at Bristol School. We had no typewriter. Such courses as typing was out of the question. Shorthand, things in that area we just couldn't offer. All we could offer would be basic things like English and math and social studies. And when you got beyond that, we just couldn't offer.
Couldn't offer that.
No ag courses, no shop courses, nothing of that nature, no.
So, well, integration went smoothly in Ashe County, I mean, as far as the school systems.
As far as I know, it probably went as smooth in Ashe County as any place in the world. When integration did come about, I had Mr. James was superintendent then, and of course he did not make any commitments to any of the black teachers at all. There was 3 of us, and that fall I had no knowledge of where I would be teaching. In fact, I did not even think I would be teaching. But during the summer, I believe it was July, he called me into the office one day and said, "I want you to meet your new boss." And the new boss was Mr. Barker, F.L. Barker, and I was to be placed at Northwest Ashe High School. And I'll say this about as far as integration, someone evidently did a lot of homework, because the first, well, 3 or 4 or 5 years at Northwest, I don't think I ever heard a derogatory term at all.
Is that right?
And the children were not, well, they gave me no problem at all. They just accepted me seemingly as an individual. Some of them might have looked at me a little strange, but they just accepted me as a person. So I was in contact with other students who did go into the white schools, and I think if there was name calling, it was at a minimum. But fortunately, we didn't have any agitators on either side. And I think integration went as smoothly in Ashe County as any place in the world.
Well, you know, the community usually hears things, and
Right.
if it hadn't, I'm sure the community would have been
Right.
aware of either the black or the white. I don't know who else would know it if the black and the white body or community bodies didn't know it. It
But
must have gone well.
I think the fact that maybe the few blacks in Ashe County and everyone knew everyone had a lot to do with it. And then, of course, certainly I don't want to minimize the influence of Mr. Oddie Cox. He was well known throughout the county, and I think most people looked at Mr. Oddie as an individual, not necessarily as a black.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe when they went into the schools, they anticipated the same thing. Of course, no two people are alike, ever.
You know, the black population is relatively small, and I'm just for this is your history that we're talking about now, but I will just inject a little bit of mine. The first black people I ever saw, there was none in our community where I lived. You know, they had the prison camp over here, and they had the road. They worked on the roads, and walking to school, we'd pass the prisoners, you know. And they were sorry for us having to walk, I guess, and missing their children and what have you. So they would make us rings out of toothbrushes. Mm-hmm. If we'd furnished a celluloid toothbrush that we no longer needed, they'd make rings for us. And the guards would allow us, or we'd give them to the guards, and they'd come back. We'd have our rings back, or whatever. They were always doing something. And we knew to stay away because the guard had a gun, but we weren't really afraid of them because they were so, they were good to us, you know. Then the next encounter was at the Foster Memorial Presbyterian Church up in Nella, where my parents and where we attended. It must have been a general Presbyterian meeting there for the Winston-Salem Presbytery, because I do remember there were people all over the place, and there were 3 black men from Winston, and they were ordaining them as ministers. And of course, we all ate together. I was just a little bitty a girl, just barely remember it. We all ate in the church together, saw the ordination of new ministers. And if anyone, we were conscious, I guess, that they were black people. And they were conscious, I suppose, that here were some mountain people, because I do remember they got out and climbed the mountains afterwards. But there were it was just a fellowship, and no one, as far as I know, thought that much about what it was. And I was talking to Dr. Stone before he died and asked him if he remembered that. And he said, well, and I told him that was my first experience, I suppose, around the black people. And he said, well, indeed he did remember it, and he told me the names of the men who were ordained, the black men who were ordained. So I guess our mountain region is a lot different from what you run into, of course, in the metropolitan areas.
Yes, it's considerably different. Speaking of that, eating together, I can remember as a boy, you would go to work at different families, just work. I did a lot of farm work as a boy, and you'd have to work for whoever had the job, and that was a white person. And there were very few, when dinner come, if you didn't have your dinner, you'd go to the table and you all ate together. Now, there were a few families that would tell you you'll have to wait until the whites eat before you can eat, but very few. Most of them, whenever they served dinner, the black and white sat down together and ate lunch. Or ate dinner, and then you went back to the field and you worked again. That sort of shows you a little of the independence, I think, independent thinking of the mountain people as a general.
They didn't go with the book, did they?
No, they didn't go with the book.
We were discussing, too, about when we were little and growing up, ghosts and witchcraft and that sort of thing. Did you ever enjoy the ghost tales as a boy?
Oh, yes, we had, I think every community had one person who'd go around and who was noted for telling ghost stories, and we had one person in my community who would come around and well, in those days there was a lot of visiting, just social visitation. You didn't have television, and in fact you had very few radios. So people would just visit from family to family, and children always liked to see this one man coming because he had some ghost tales to tell, and as a general, when he finished, you sometimes were afraid to go to bed after listening to him tell some of his ghost stories. And even had me looking for ghosts as a boy, and unfortunately, even to today, I've never seen one. And I've never seen or heard anything that I couldn't explain, but about to convince me there at one time that there was such a thing.
How about witchcraft in your community? Did you have any practice in witchcraft?
None that I know of, but now I will inject this note. I think a lot of blacks did believe in witchcraft. As a boy, I've heard many stories of witchcraft, involving witchcraft. I do know that when I was teaching at Bristol, even when I was teaching there, I knew of one family who did make trips occasionally to Winston-Salem to visit what they call a witch doctor, who I think would supply them with some type of roots or herbs that had unusual powers and whatnot. I've heard my father speak about persons putting spells on persons. I've never actually seen any of it. I've heard of things that people could do, but I've never actually seen any of it, and didn't really believe in it to a great extent. But I think some of my ancestors might have believed in it rather deeply. Most black people are pretty emotional when it comes to religion or belief in the supernatural. They're pretty emotional along that line. And a lot of them did not have what you would call a great deal of formal education. And people who don't have a lot of formal education, sometimes it's pretty easy to influence their mind into believing in the supernatural.
The mind is a powerful thing.
It is a powerful thing, yes. And the emotions of the human being is a powerful thing, too.
And combined, you can get some good things
Yes.
going, I guess.
Yes.
I've never been too worried about seeing a ghost myself, but I have heard some tales that are supposed to be gospel, and they're supposed to be the very truth. And
I have heard many of them that, would make you think and stop and ponder. Some of them I don't think were the imagination of the persons involved.
they're unexplainable.
But a lot of them, I don't know. Sometimes I've heard a lot of older persons say that ghosts were warnings to persons of impending maybe disaster or something along that line. And I tend to incorporate that a little bit in my thinking, too, that anything that's out of the normal might be in the form of a warning to an individual, or something along that line.
We were also discussing earlier a little bit about in Ashe County, there's so few blacks, as we said, yet we managed to have a Ku Klux Klan organization here some years ago. Of course, it had no race barriers. I think it kept the whites straight, too. Did you ever hear of any tales about the Ku Klux Klan?
Yes. In fact, when I was a boy, I guess I was born then, they whipped a couple of people in my community, one black and one white. Again, I don't guess it really, in many instances, did not have racial barriers, because I think the white person was whipped for just not taking care of his family. And the black person was whipped for that, along with some other things involved. So I don't think I've ever seen a Klansman to know him. I've heard my parents talking about having seen them hooded Klansmen, but I never saw one. And I guess the organization as such, well, I think maybe at the time integration first came about, there might have been an element of the clans in the county. You know, when the first Supreme Court decision was handed down, a lot of people could foresee an immediate change in the social structure, and there might have been an element of the Klan in the county then. We had a few black agitators too at the same time, but as it wore on and as people become a little better enlightened, I think if there was an element, it quickly faded, because certainly when the schools were integrated, I don't think any part of the Klan was evident. I don't think there was.
Let's see, I think it was in 1954 that maybe that the Supreme Court determined that segregation would no longer be
Right,
in
I think,
schools.
if I made no mistake, it was 1954.
So what really, to me, that's not all that far back, you know.
No,
but I know to young people, I'm sure they have a different idea of the time. Now, before that, you were not. Now, were the blacks in the county not allowed to go to a restaurant here?
Most restaurants did not serve blacks. Many restaurants would allow a black to come in and purchase maybe a sandwich or something, but you could not eat it within the establishment. A lot of them didn't even allow blacks within the establishment. As a boy, though, I think I can remember, and I know I can remember seeing my father and an uncle out of my community sit down at a sandwich stand in one of the local drugstores, and they were served, mainly because the person who owned the establishment knew them as individuals, and they'd say, "Oh, sit down and have a seat," and they would get a sandwich and eat. And no one made any big racket about it. It's just one of those things. But by and large, when I grew up, I guess most black persons ate at home anyway, but if you did come to town, restaurants did not serve blacks by and large.
So you just expected that, didn't you?
Right,
you
you
knew you would.
You didn't challenge the situation at that particular time.
And the public libraries, they didn't allow.
I'm trying to recall. My earliest recollection of the library, of course, I guess, was after I had come back into the county, and of course I could go in the library and get a book anytime then. I think at that time the library was in Jefferson. Prior to then, as growing up as a boy, I just cannot recall what the library policies were. I just can't recall what they were. If Ashe County even had a public library at that time.
Well, as I said, I don't think Ashe County is it being remote, and our mountain people are being more independent by nature. I don't think they cared about going by many rules and regulations.
No, I have long come to the conclusion in this thing called race relations that where you have a few blacks or a few whites, either one, they tend to be more or less incorporated within the general population, and
They absorb them.
their
don't they?
differences are not magnified. But where you have, say, a population ratio of 50 to 50, then those differences are greatly magnified, and you have worlds of problems. But in Ashe County, with so few black people and most whites within the county, knowing most of the blacks and most of them being individual thinkers, race relations never was a real problem in Ashe County. In my opinion, they have never been a real problem in Ashe County.
I would say you're right. Well, what's your thoughts on the future? Ashe County's not going to change, I don't believe, but how about the world in general? Do you think it's improvements are going to be lasting, or?
I don't know. I would almost be afraid to speculate on what the future would be like. It would be hard to say. Well, I don't know, really. But as far as Ashe County, I think it will always remain as is. It's a good area. It's people change. They change slowly. Whatever little problems or racial problems that might have had, like other places, they will tend to disappear. As people work together and get to know each other as individuals, then I think those little differences that they do have tend to disappear.
I think it seems as though in the mountain region, that's more so. I mean, it seems to work that way so strongly because they are pretty well judged by what kind of person they are.
Very much so, I think. Yes.
Rather than maybe more so than you'd find in other places. So, well, I thank you for. Have we overlooked anything?